From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
And at this point, on many parts of the island, we're without power because of the first storm that came through. That was Irma. We're without water in many districts. Can you imagine this now? Catastrophic. We're going to be, I think, without services for a long time.
Puerto Rico goes dark after losing 100% power during Hurricane Maria. The country is home to 23 Superfund sites, including the island of Vieques on there, site of a former U.S. naval test range, which took a near-direct hit from the storm. We'll speak with New Republic reporter Emily Atkin, who writes, Puerto Rico's already an environmental tragedy. Hurricane Maria will make it even worse. Then President Trump gives his first address to the UN General Assembly, boasting about the size of the U.S. military, threatening to totally destroy North Korea.
The United States has great strength and patience, but if it is forced to defend itself or its allies, we will have no choice but to totally destroy North Korea. Rocket Man is on a suicide mission for himself and for his regime.
We'll get reaction from leading economist Jeff Sachs on North Korea, Iran, climate change, and President Trump. Then as Burma continues its ethnic cleansing of the Rohingya Muslim minority with more than 400,000 people forced out of Burma, we'll speak with reporter Andrea Pitzer, author of the new book, One Long Night, A Global History of Concentration Camps. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. In Mexico, the death toll from the massive magnitude 7.1 earthquake has risen to 250 people as rescue workers continue to search for missing people amidst the rubble. The earthquake struck just hours after residents participated in an earthquake preparedness drill marking the 32nd anniversary of the 1985 earthquake that killed 5,000 people. Mexican President Enrique Peña Nieto has declared 3 days of national mourning. Tuesday's quake caused scores of buildings and at least one school to collapse. On Wednesday, residents gathered at the site of collapsed buildings, hoping for news about their missing family members.
I am Vanessa Rivera Rosales, and I am looking for my brother in this building that fell down. He worked here, and we don't know where he is. They told me that he is in a hospital with his wife, that they were able to get out of the building, but that is not true. His wife is in critical condition, but we don't know if my brother went to look for my sister-in-law or where he is. We have been calling him, and it rings, but he doesn't answer. If he was okay, he would have answered. This is all very sad, and we truly ask people to help us with supplies and water for all those that are here, and if they know anything about Jaime Rivera Rosales, that they let us know, please.
To hear our full interview on the earthquake with Laura Carlson in Mexico City, go to democracynow.org. Millions of people are without power in Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria made landfall Wednesday as a Category 4 storm. It was the most powerful hurricane to hit the island in nearly a century. The hurricane brought record rainfall and catastrophic flooding to Puerto Rico. The National Weather Service warned early this morning of flash flooding risks across the entire island. Puerto Rico's governor, Ricardo Rosselló, says at least one person has died in Puerto Rico and that the death toll may rise when communication with the southeastern part of the island is reestablished. Meanwhile, the death toll on the island nation of Dominica has risen to 14. The hurricane caused widespread devastation there when it made landfall as a Category 5 storm, which also destroyed parts of the U.S. and British Virgin Islands and killed 2 people on the French island of Guadeloupe. Early this morning, the hurricane passed just north of the Dominican Republic and Haiti, lashing the island with winds up to 115 miles an hour. It's now gathering strength as it barrels towards Turks and Caicos and the Bahamas. At the United Nations headquarters in New York City, dozens of countries have signed onto a landmark treaty to ban nuclear weapons worldwide. The United Nations calls it the world's first legally binding treaty banning nuclear weapons. It prohibits the development, testing, and possession of nuclear weapons, as well as using or threatening to use these weapons. The treaty was approved by 122 UN member states in July, despite heavy U.S. opposition to the treaty. Following the treaty's approval, approval, the U.S., Britain, and France published a joint statement saying they, quote, have not taken part in the negotiation of the treaty and do not intend to sign, ratify, or ever become party to it, unquote. The treaty will take effect 90 days after 50 UN member states have ratified it. Meanwhile, President Trump told reporters Wednesday he's made a decision about whether he'll take action to undo the landmark 2015 Iran nuclear deal, but refused to say what his plans are. NBC is reporting, based on unnamed sources, Trump is leaning toward decertifying the deal, even though Secretary of State Rex Tillerson acknowledged Wednesday Iran is in compliance with the deal. All other parties to the Iran nuclear deal also agree Iran is in compliance. This is the European Union's foreign policy chief, Federica Mogherini.
It has been a frank, open, and in-depth discussion, during which we have agreed on the fact that all sides are implementing so far fully the agreement.
On Wednesday, the Iranian President Hassan Rouhani slammed Trump's threats to undo the landmark deal.
I really don't know whether a country or a power or an individual who tries to back out of this agreement, other than bringing embarrassment upon themselves, they will gain nothing from it. If the United States government exits the agreement, undoubtedly it will be condemned by the American people themselves, and before that by the European Union, by all countries throughout the world. The condemnation will be equal, and even the allies of the United States will no longer have the courage to support America vis-a-vis this issue.
President Trump met with Egyptian President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi on Wednesday. Ahead of the meeting, Trump said he's considering resuming military aid to Egypt. Last month, the U.S. denied Egypt nearly $100 million in military funding and other aid and withheld another nearly $200 million in foreign military financing, saying the money would be released when the human rights conditions improve. Sisi's government has launched a wide-ranging crackdown against human rights activists and press freedom advocates in Egypt. Former President Barack Obama has slammed the Republicans' latest effort to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act.
When I see people trying to undo that hard-won progress for the 50th or 60th time, with bills that would raise costs or reduce coverage, or roll back protections for older Americans or people with pre-existing conditions, the cancer survivor, the expecting mom, or the child with autism, or asthma, for whom coverage, once again, would be almost unattainable, it is aggravating. And all of this being done without any demonstrable economic or actuarial or plain common sense rationale, it frustrates.
That was former President Obama speaking Wednesday at an event sponsored by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. On Wednesday, the health insurance industry also came out against the Republican plan known as the Graham-Cassidy bill, warning it could cause chaos in the healthcare industry. Meanwhile, President Trump tweeted a flurry of support for the plan throughout the day, tweeting, quote, "I hope Republican senators will vote for Graham-Cassidy and fulfill their promise to repeal and replace Obamacare money direct to states," unquote. He later tweeted, "I would not sign Graham-Cassidy if it did not include coverage of pre-existing conditions. It does. A great bill, repeal and replace," unquote. In fact, healthcare experts say there is no guarantee the Graham-Cassidy bill will protect people with pre-existing conditions. California has sued President Trump over the construction of his proposed border wall, saying the administration's not complying with state and federal environmental laws. This is California Attorney General Xavier Becerra.
The border between the U.S. and Mexico spans some 2,000 miles. The list of laws violated by the president's administration in order to build his campaign wall is almost as long. The Department of Homeland Security would waive 37 federal statutes, as well as regulations that are related to those statutes, and he would also violate numerous state and local laws here in our great state of California.
In the West African nation of Togo, hundreds of thousands of people took to the streets across the country on Wednesday to demand an end to decades of rule by the Nasingbe family dynasty. Security forces attacked the protesters, shooting live bullets and tear gas into the crowds. Amnesty International says military forces shot a 9-year-old boy in the head, killing him during the crackdown. Wednesday's protest is the latest in weeks of massive demonstrations demanding President Faure Gnassingbé's ouster and the reinstatement of constitutional term limits in Togo. The Spanish government's dramatically escalated its crackdown against an upcoming independence referendum in Catalonia. On Wednesday, the Spanish police raided the Catalan regional government's offices and arrested at least 14 people. The arrest prompted thousands to pour into the streets of Barcelona to protest the crackdown. About 1,000 more protesters gathered for a solidarity rally in Spain's capital, Madrid. The referendum scheduled for October 1st. The Spanish government says the referendum is illegal. This is the Catalan president.
These days, and especially today, the Spanish government has de facto suspended the self-rule of Catalonia and has de facto applied a state of emergency. Freedom is being suspended and repressed. The government of Catalonia will analyze in the coming hours with economic and social and civic institutions the appropriate response to give. In any case, citizens are called to vote on October 1st to defend democracy before a repressive and intimidating regime, which we have to give a massive and civic response.
The journalistic monitoring group Air Wars says U.S.-led coalition airstrikes along the Syria-Iraq border reportedly killed at least 6 civilians and wounded up to 24 more people on Sunday. The airstrikes reportedly targeted villages west of the Iraqi city of Anbar. In Croatia, billboards depicting First Lady Melania Trump had been removed after she threatened a lawsuit. The billboards advertised an English-language school by showing an image of Melania Trump along with the phrase, "Just imagine how far you can go with a little bit of English." Back in the United States, former TV commentator Scotty Now Hughes sued Fox News on Monday, saying she was raped by longtime anchor Charles Payne and then coerced into maintaining a sexual relationship with him in exchange for airtime and career opportunities. In her lawsuit, Hughes says she was blacklisted by Fox News in 2016 after she ended the relationship and came forward with rape allegations. Fox News denies the charges, calling them bogus and downright shameful. It's the latest sexual abuse scandal to rock the network. Host Eric Bolling was suspended last month amidst accusations that he texted unwanted photos of his genitals to female co-workers. Former Fox News star Bill O'Reilly was fired in April amidst revelations he and Fox News had paid out $13 million to settle lawsuits by 5 women who accused O'Reilly of sexual harassment and inappropriate sexual behavior. And longtime Fox News head Roger Ailes was ousted last year after more than 20 women accused him of sexual harassment. He has since died. In North Dakota, local judges are petitioning the North Dakota Supreme Court to end a program that allows out-of-state lawyers to represent the hundreds of water protectors who were arrested amidst the month-long resistance at Standing Rock against the Dakota Access Pipeline. The Water Protector Legal Collective says ending the program could leave more than 100 water protectors without legal representation. More than 300 people are still facing criminal charges. The North Dakota Supreme Court is currently accepting comments on the proposal to end the right for water protectors to have representation from out-of-state lawyers. And prominent Palestinian activist Rasmia Odeh has been deported from the United States after living in the United States for more than 20 years. Odeh was convicted of immigration fraud in 2014 and sentenced to 18 months in prison and deportation for failing to disclose her conviction on bombing charges by an Israeli military court more than 40 years ago. Odeh says her conviction more than 40 years ago was obtained through weeks of torture and sexual assault in Israeli custody. Her supporters say she was targeted over her support for Palestinian liberation. On Tuesday, Rasmia Odeh addressed the crowd of friends and supporters who gathered at Chicago's O'Hare Airport to say goodbye before she was deported to Jordan.
I will continue in my struggle, and we will continue to contact each other. is one struggle wherever we are going. It's difficult for me, not because they just want to take deportation decision to deport me from the country, but to separate me from all of you and from all the people that I love and they love me.
And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, DemocracyNow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Nermeen Sheikh. Welcome to our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. We begin today's show in Puerto Rico, where Hurricane Maria made landfall Wednesday as a Category 4 storm, bringing record rainfall and catastrophic flooding, destroying power lines and leaving the entire country in the dark. Puerto Rico's Governor Ricardo Rossello says at least one person has died, and the death toll is expected to rise when communication with the southeastern part of the island is reestablished. This is Puerto Rican resident Grisel Cruz.
And at this point, on many parts of the island, we're without power because of the first storm that came through. That was Irma. We're without water in many districts. Can you imagine this now? Catastrophic. We're going to be, I think, without services for a long time.
Hurricane Maria has already killed at least 2 people on the island of Guadeloupe and devastated the island of Dominica.
This comes as many homes in Puerto Rico were still dark 2 weeks after Hurricane Irma cut electricity to hundreds of thousands. The storm also raised concerns about potential environmental disasters. Puerto Rico is home to 23 Superfund sites, including on the island of Vieques, site of a former U.S. naval test range, which took a near-direct hit from the storm. It's also the site of a coal-fired power plant owned by the private company AES. Residents across the island have been demanding the plant be closed and that the company stop dumping toxic coal ash into their community, saying the waste is poisonous to their health and environment. For more, we're joined by Emily Atkins, staff writer covering the environment at the New Republic. In her latest article, she writes, Puerto Rico is already an environmental tragedy. Hurricane Maria will make it even worse. Emily, welcome to Democracy Now! Talk about the environmental crisis, as at this point, after this storm, apparently 100% of Puerto Rico is dark. There is no electricity.
That's true. And to what you said, their environmental crisis, every single major hurricane is a major pollution event, especially when it hits a populated area. But the fact that this major hurricane hit Puerto Rico, that's an even more major pollution event because Puerto Rico has extreme pollution problems. You mentioned the fact that the 100% of power is out across the island. That's a problem. That would be a problem in any situation because most sewage systems are run on electric pumps. Sewage systems easily become overwhelmed during flooding, especially if they're shut off. If all the sewage systems are off, that means that there are going to be prolonged releases of sewage into floodwaters and into soil, which poses a long-term health risk if people come in contact with those waters or with that soil. That's a normal problem. There are other issues that are very unique to Puerto Rico and that have to do with their extensive financial crisis. And there are situations that, frankly, we would not accept in the mainland United States. One of those is the fact that most of the landfills on Puerto Rico are overflowing with liquid garbage. They're at capacity. They do not have the financial means to create new landfills or secure them. What's more, the coal ash, the toxic coal ash that you mentioned, is frequently dumped in these landfills. Flooding in those landfills threatens an overflow, threatens contamination of floodwaters. As you mentioned as well, there's coal ash disposed across the island in ways that are very controversial, one of which I talk a lot about in my piece is a 5-story uncovered pile of coal ash. 5 stories, think about that. That's a large building just of uncovered coal ash sitting next to a community of 45,000 people. That community, I saw footage from that community where water was flowing through the streets like a river and winds were whipping, one of the more extreme wind videos that I've seen. So there are a lot of concerns that I could talk about for a while.
I just want to follow up on that coal ash point, because Democracy Now! Just reported on the growing movement of Puerto Rican residents demanding the closure of the island's only coal-fired plant, and that the company, Applied Energy Systems, stopped dumping toxic coal ash near the southern town of Peñuelas. This is resident Yanina Moreno describing the company's track record.
When the company AES was established in Puerto Rico at the end of the 1990s, the contract with the Authority of Electrical Energy, which supplies energy to Puerto Rico and its residents, the contract established that the residuals of carbon combustion and the ashes generated by the burning of coal in the plant would not be disposed here in Puerto Rico. Instead, they would be exported. So they began taking those ashes someplace else, and among those places was the Dominican Republic. A series of problems began there. The people who lived in the communities where the ashes were being disposed began presenting symptoms, including respiratory problems and pregnancy problems. Babies were born without extremities or with their intestines exposed. From there, the situation in Peñuela began because they began depositing the ashes in the landfill. The landfill is very close, just meters away from various communities, so we've been resisting for 2 years. For 2 years, we've had an active encampment against the disposal of ashes in Puerto Rico.
That was Yanina Moreno, a resident, describing the company's track record. It's a long-time struggle now in Puerto Rico. Special thanks to Democracy Now's Laura Gottesdiener and Juan Carlos Davila, who were in Puerto Rico to do that report. And that was before the storms, Emily, before the storms.
Yeah, like I said, there's that 5-story ash sort of pile, but then are just sort of little piles of ash all over the southern part of the island. One of the things that I think your former guest was talking about was just the fact that this company transports the ash in open trucks, meaning that fugitive dust, aka coal ash that blows off in the wind, comes off and is just sitting on a lot of Puerto Rican riverbanks, a lot of the sides of roads. And what she mentioned about the health impacts, that's something that's been reported all over in places with coal ash, but it's very hard to prove attribution from coal ash to human health impacts. And that's what the failings in the science there, or the inability of the science to do that at this moment, is what gets companies like AES off the hook in situations like this.
And what about the situation, Emily, in Vieques? Can you talk about what's going on there?
Yeah, unfortunately, it's very hard to get in communication with anyone in Vieques because it is an island off of Puerto Rico, and they were also, that island of 9,000 people was also majorly hit by Irma. Irma skirted most of the mainland Puerto Rico, but it hit Vieques pretty hard. Vieques is now sort of a tourist destination, but for 60 years, it was used by the U.S. military as a bomb testing site. And so we would just explode munitions all over this island. And the result of that, we no longer use it as a bomb testing site because of protests and because of contamination. Now it's a federal Superfund site because 75% of the island is contaminated with waste from the munitions, and that's in the soil and that's in the water. There are also unexploded munitions, meaning bombs, ammunition, other types of explosives that are unexploded all over the island. That's not really a concern for them detonating, but it is a concern for them leaking whatever's in them, especially when very high winds and lots of flooding hit an area. Like I said, Superfund concerns are always a problem. We saw that Hurricane Harvey in the Houston area with the San Jacinto waste pits potentially overflowing, and we've already seen spills from there. This is a situation where almost an entire island is a Superfund site. It's one of the most contaminated, most expensive military Superfund sites we have. And it's going to take a lot of effort and a lot of attention to assess, once we can get over there, once we can start talking to people, what exactly happened, how chemicals spread, if they spread if munitions got into the ocean.
Interestingly, Emily, we just had Congressman Luis Gutierrez on our show 2 days ago before he got arrested at Trump Tower protesting immigration policy. He's been arrested a number of times in those protests, but he was also arrested twice protesting the U.S. Navy's bombing of Vieques. You talk about Superfund sites. Democracy Now! Was in Houston after the hurricane at a Superfund site as well. But just explain what they are, and also what is FEMA and the EPA, of course, Puerto Rico is a part of the United States. Puerto Ricans are American citizens doing right now with this storm. You know, we saw both of these storms coming, so much devastation on the island.
The EPA, from what I know, is not yet in Puerto Rico. I got a notice yesterday that they were waiting for conditions to stall, to not be so bad before they sent people there to assess these Superfund sites. Superfund sites are the nation's most industrially polluted sites. If a site gets the designation of Superfund, it means it's not safe for you to walk there without protective gear. It means it's not safe for you to touch the soil or touch water around there. They're sites where usually, you know, sort of during the Industrial Revolution, when we did not have environmental regulations, paper mills, oil refineries, pharmaceutical companies, pesticide companies sort of freely released their waste into either groundwater, water, soil, pits, any situation that's just gross, to be honest. And we see those. There are over 1,000 all over the U.S., 23 in Puerto Rico. And like I said earlier in the program, there's always a risk of contamination, of contaminants spreading from Superfund sites when a major hurricane hits. And it's something that we're going to be dealing with in Puerto Rico. It's something we're dealing with in Florida now, in Texas, and that we'll continue to deal with so long as these sites remain contaminated and so long as we keep getting more intense hurricanes.
Well, Emily, we're going to link to your piece, staff writer, on the environment of the New Republic. Puerto Rico is already an environmental tragedy. Hurricane Maria will make it even worse. Thanks so much for joining us. When we come back, leading economist Jeffrey Sachs on, well, President Trump's speech, North Korea, Iran, Afghanistan, climate change, and more. Stay with us.
Canto a mi bandera herida, al machete y al sombrero de mi Ibarra querida, al tambor del indio errante, a la estrella el guerrillero del guerrillero brillante. Canto también al malvado que robó mi sueño amado, y con toda mi conciencia yo le deseo la miseria por la que estamos pasando.
Like the Wind in Motion by Estrella Artau, here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.
President Trump gave his first address to the UN General Assembly Tuesday, boasting about the size of the U.S. military, threatening to withdraw from the Iran nuclear deal, hinting at an intervention in Venezuela, and threatening to totally destroy North Korea. The 40-minute speech was reportedly written by Trump's senior advisor, Stephen Miller, and did not call out other authoritarian countries that are U.S. allies, including Egypt, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia. In his sharpest of many threats, Trump called North Korean leader Kim Jong-un Rocket Man and said the U.S. was prepared to destroy an entire nation of 25 million people.
The United States has great strength and patience. But if it is forced to defend itself or its allies, we will have no choice but to totally destroy North Korea. Rocket Man is on a suicide mission for himself and for his regime.
North Korea's ambassador walked out of the UN General Assembly just as Trump took the podium. Iran's government condemned Trump's remarks as shameless and ignorant, while the Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro said from Caracas Trump is the new Hitler of international politics. This is Jorge Ariaza, Venezuela's chancellor to the United Nations.
This is supposed to be the house and the headquarters of the peace and the international law. And what we heard was the opposite of that. It's a president who comes for the first time and speaks about war, about destroying countries, about blockades against countries.
That's Venezuela's foreign minister. For more, we're joined by Jeffrey Sachs, university professor and director of the Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia University. Professor Sachs is a leading economist, author of many books, including Building the New American Economy, Smart, Fair, and Sustainable. The book's foreword is by Bernie Sanders. Professor Sachs, welcome back to Democracy Now!
Thanks a lot.
So you were there at the time that President Trump gave his first UN address before the General Assembly. Start with North Korea and take it from there.
Horrifying. Of course, there was a shudder in the room. No president of the United States has declared from the podium of the United Nations General Assembly that the U.S. is ready to totally destroy a country. It was absolutely shocking, and the whole speech was grotesque in my view.
Why?
Because it was militaristic, it was filled with grievance, with bias, with ignorance. Trump is a very dangerous man. There's no question about it. He is individually a very dangerous man, and the United States right now is a very dangerous country.
And what was the response amongst other member states and other people present in the General Assembly when he spoke?
Well, you could hear shuffling chuckles, amazement, gasps, a few applause. There was Netanyahu enthusiastically applauding. It was a very odd scene. I am still a bit shaken by it.
And Secretary of State Tillerson was there, as was Ambassador Nikki Haley. Did you have the sense that there was that they were in agreement with what he was saying?
Well, I suppose that they are, or they should get out of the administration. This is policy, and it is grotesque. And it is extraordinarily dangerous.
When Trump called the North Korean leader, Kim Jong-un, Rocket Man, and said the U.S. is prepared to destroy this entire nation of 25 million people, North Korea's foreign minister issued the country's first response to Trump's remarks on Thursday.
If Trump was thinking about surprising us with the sound of a dog barking, then he is clearly dreaming.
That was the North Korean representative.
I've been reminded often in these days of a statement by President John F. Kennedy when he said in 1963 that in the nuclear age, to put an adversary at the choice of a nuclear war or a humiliating retreat would show the bankruptcy of our policy or a collective death wish for the world. President Kennedy was a great man. We have right now an administration which is endangering America and the world.
So let's talk one by one about the states that President Trump called out. North Korea, what do you think has to be done? I mean, in all of these cases, it involves more than one country on that country. This involves more than the U.S. and North Korea, as does Iran, of course. What has to happen with North Korea?
First, we have to avoid a nuclear war. And a nuclear war is a real threat. It's not some idle imagination right now. You have two leaders, both seem unstable, yelling at each other. Both have nuclear arms. Seoul, South Korea is a few minutes, moments away from the North Korean arms.
Well, President Trump has been attacking the North Korean president, the South Korean president as well.
I've heard people say, well, South Korea, that would be collateral damage. It's unbelievable the way people are talking right now and how close we are to disaster and how complacent we are because it's unimaginable. Now, I'm not saying it's inevitable, but I am saying it is absolutely being pushed right now, recklessly. And of course, what first needs to happen is to tamp down this kind of absolutely dangerous, provocative rhetoric. The North Koreans made a statement a few days ago that was not well covered, which said we are looking for a military equilibrium to avoid a military option, meaning we don't want to be overthrown by the United States. The U.S., of course, is a serial regime changer. In fact, our foreign policy is based on covert and overt wars of overthrow of other countries. Saddam Hussein, Muammar Gaddafi, Bashar al-Assad, a disaster that has created absolute chaos, indeed all three of them. North Korea basically said a few days ago, we don't want to be overthrown. Well, that is absolutely correct. We should have diplomacy, politics, not a nuclear exchange.
And where China's role in this?
Well, China also doesn't want chaos. China is calling every day for a diplomatic response. And we know that a diplomatic response is possible. Indeed, when the challenge was Iran, you had all 5 members, permanent members of the UN Security Council plus Germany, making a historic agreement with Iran. Precisely the one that Trump is attacking right now vis-a-vis Iran. So we're just pushing for war. It's incredible.
Are you concerned that the whole investigation of Trump around Russian issues is, as the prosecutor is breathing down his neck, that he will do something rash internationally to distract attention?
I don't know if it's to distract attention or whether he is just psychologically profoundly unstable, and he is, or just ignorant, which he is, or vicious and biased and stereotyping and without historical knowledge, which he is, all of those things. So I don't know what it will be, but I do know that the United States has a war tendency, and it is restrained only at the top, actually. And here you have a president who is egging on, provoking, himself unstable, without attention span. It's extraordinarily dangerous. And where is the Congress? Not one word by our Congress. It's a disgrace because under our Constitution, Congress has the only authority to declare war. And our Congress is useless, as we know, in this because they've just ceded the authority to an imperial presidency. And now we have a president completely unfit and absolutely provocative every day.
Well, let's go to President Trump's comments also on Tuesday at the General Assembly when he slammed the Iran nuclear deal.
The Iran deal was one of the worst and most one-sided transactions the United States has ever entered into. Frankly, that deal is an embarrassment to the United States, and I don't think you've heard the last of it, believe me. It is time for the entire world to join us in demanding that Iran's government end its pursuit of death and destruction. It is time for the regime to free all Americans and citizens of other nations that they have unjustly detained. And above all, Iran's government must stop supporting terrorists, begin serving its own people, and respect the sovereign rights of its neighbors.
So that's Trump speaking on Tuesday, saying that the Iran nuclear deal is an embarrassment to the United States.
And NBC is reporting that he is going to decertify.
The last time we had this kind of rhetoric was George W. Bush with the axis of evil. It was immediately followed by the Iraq War, which was the most disastrous single step of American military action and quote, diplomacy or anti-diplomacy in modern times. So this is a setup, again, for war, for conflict, and it is extraordinarily ignorant and dangerous. Iran is in compliance with the agreement that was reached.
Rex Tillerson has said that.
He has said that, and it's an agreement that is reached not just with the United States, but with the UK, with France, with Russia, with China, with Germany, with all of the permanent members of the Security Council. It's endorsed by the world. And of course, this is Trump in this kind of bizarre sense of grievance, arrogance, and ignorance that absolutely is a prelude to conflict.
And now Iran is saying that they may start enriching uranium.
Iran is, of course,
responding to
bewildered, but after the deal was made, Iran had elections, and the moderate president, Hassan Rouhani, was reelected despite opposition from hardliners, and the U.S. response is to provoke. Now, why is this happening? Because 2 U.S. allies, Israel and Saudi Arabia, are luring our ignorant president into this kind of vehemence This is Israeli and Saudi policy. Saudis because of the Sunni-Shia conflict and battle for regional power. Israel because of its own narrow concerns. And all the United States is doing, Trump is doing, is being lured into this and making the U.S. unsafe and making the world unsafe. It's shocking.
In fact, one of his first meetings on Monday was with Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister. Trump.
Netanyahu is a threat, absolutely, and is a provocation and is gunning for war with Iran and has been for years, and Trump is playing into his hand.
But as you said that Trump is an ignorant president who's being drawn into this by Saudi Arabia and Israel. So let's assume that that's true. You've also criticized Congress for ceding authority to this imperial presidency, and your assumption is, which is probably correct, that if Rex Tillerson and other members of his administration dealing with foreign policy continue to work with him, then that's an implicit acknowledgement that they side with whatever it is that he's saying. So within the U.S. government, Congress, or the executive, there's no limit on what Trump can do. What you're suggesting is no one will stand in the way of whatever it is that Trump intends to do, whether it's to go to war or whatever it is that he decides.
I believe the American people who do not want war and we need to avoid war need to speak out right now, because I believe these are the drumbeats of war. We've heard them many times before. Our government absolutely is war-oriented. We have a deep security state which believes in overthrowing other countries. We have a secret army called the CIA, which is engaged in covert wars all over the world. And we have a president who is openly provocative, openly gunning for war, it seems, with these two countries and heaven knows how many more.
You've been writing about Afghanistan.
Well, Afghanistan has been in the U.S. Gun sight since 1979. We know that the CIA went into a secret war in Afghanistan back in 1979 to try to lure the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union said, we're going into Afghanistan in part because there's destabilization by the CIA. Everybody laughed. Oh, look at the Soviet propaganda, and conspiracy was absolutely true, revealed by U.S. authorities decades later. Since then, that country has been in constant war. We have profoundly destabilized it. We invaded in 2001. Trump has said during the campaign, it was one of the few glimmers of sanity, rationality, said we shouldn't be in there. But of course, once he got into the Oval Office, the generals assembled. He's surrounded by generals, remember, his chief of staff, his national security advisor, his secretary of defense. Those are civilian positions in American tradition. They're all generals. And they're telling him, you expand the military reach in Afghanistan. We also found out that they had been lying about how many American military were actually in Afghanistan for years, keeping the number lower than the truth by various tricks of rotations and the counting and the timing. So we don't even know what really goes on with our secret wars, but Trump is absolutely not stopping any of it.
At the United Nations, President Trump's chief economic advisor, Gary Cohn, said Monday the U.S. will withdraw from the landmark 2015 Paris Climate Accord as planned. His comments came as the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, said climate should be a top priority at this year's General Assembly. The UN Secretary General urging countries to go above and beyond the Paris Climate Accord commitments.
Countries have signed up to the Paris Agreement, but we know that current pledges and plans are insufficient to keep global temperature rise to well below 2 degrees. In 2020, parties will review progress. By then, we need to make sure that we have substantially raised the bar of ambition. We are still on a path for a world that may be 3 or more degrees warmer.
So that was the UN attorney, the UN Secretary General. You talk, Jeffrey Sachs, about this, also about your encounter on CNN when you were calling out the Trump backer.
Basically, what we're viewing here is the corruption of American politics, because the oil lobby owns the Republican Party. It is the Republican Party that said to Trump, who himself has no values after all, pull out of Paris. A letter by 22 Republican senators, which one can find online, and then go to opensecrets.org to find out how much they're paid by the oil industry, provoked this. Gary Cohn, that's another disgrace. If you don't like it, get out of there. But that's Goldman talking. That's Wall Street, the oil industry. It's a mess. We've got ExxonMobil owning the State Department right now. We have Ken Pruitt at EPA, who is an oil and gas industry hack from beginning to end, dismantling the Environmental Protection Agency as we're experiencing one disaster after another. And here comes the United States to tell the other 192 countries, because this is a unanimous global agreement, all 193 countries, we're stepping back with 4 catastrophic hurricanes in a row. Basically, this is not imbecility, though it looks like imbecility. This is just corruption of American politics. Chevron, ExxonMobil, Koch Industries, they paid for this. If you're an American, they are endangering your life.
You said these chemical companies, these oil companies, should be paying for the recovery after these hurricanes.
They are going to pay eventually, because there are going to be lawsuits and litigation and international court of justice challenges, because these oil companies are, with foreseeability, the legal doctrine, with intent, committing what is basically a tort, a wrong committed of endangering the lives of the people in Puerto Rico, the lives of the people all through the Caribbean, the lives of Americans in Houston and in Florida. And it's going to be, of course, we experienced it here in New York with Superstorm Sandy. These are exactly the kinds of shocks that are becoming more and more intense and more frequent because of global warming. And then you have people like Gary Cohn, disgraceful, coming and saying, we pull out of the Paris Climate Agreement. And Trump, in his fantasy world, which is a fantasy world, says this agreement is unfair to the United States. If you look at the agreement is completely symmetrical for all 193 countries. There's not one phrase about the United States in the agreement. It's a completely symmetrical agreement globally. And Trump, because he's a man of grievance, of belligerence, of hate, says that's against the United States.
Well, I want to thank you very much, Jeffrey Sachs, for coming in, leading economist, director of the Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia University's most recent book, with a foreword by Bernie Sanders, is titled Building the New American Economy, Smart, Fair, and Sustainable. This is Democracy Now! Back in a minute.
Sáquese de aquí, señor operador, que este es un secuestro y yo manejo el convoy. Mejor haga caso, para ustedes mejor, así es que hágase un lado porque ahí le voy. Hace 4 años que a mi novia perdí, en esas muchedumbres que se forman aquí. La busqué en andenes y en salas de espera, pero ella se perdió en la estación de Valderas. En la estación del metro Valderas. Ahí fue donde yo perdí a mi amor. En la estación del metro Valderas.
Oh, a shout out to Girl Scout Troop 4723 from Queens and Indie Kids who have come to watch Democracy Now! Today in our studios here in New York. And that music, Balderas subway station by Rodrigo Gonzalez, who was killed in the 1985 Mexico City earthquake. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.
We end today's show with a new book that examines the history of mass civil detention without trial. It comes as a humanitarian crisis is unfolding in Burma, where more than 400,000 members of the Rohingya Muslim minority have fled the country after hundreds of their villages were burned to the ground, and the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights has accused the Burmese government of waging a textbook example of ethnic cleansing.
Meanwhile, in the United States, there are increasing displays of anti-immigrant sentiment and anti-Semitism. At last month's Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, neo-Nazis and Ku Klux Klansmen displayed swastikas, marched with torches. Members of the local synagogue, Congregation Beth Israel, said men dressed in fatigues and carrying semi-automatic rifles stood across the street, prompting people to leave their Saturday service from the back of the synagogue in groups as a safety precaution. A recent column in Newsweek detailed additional security plans by a Jewish congregation in Texas to celebrate this week's High Holy Days at an undisclosed location. For more, we're joined by Andrea Pitzer, journalist and author. Her book has just been published. It's titled One Long Night, A Global History of Concentration Camps. Andrea Pitzer, welcome back to Democracy Now! Why don't you start by responding to what has taken place in the last month, and then talk about why you've chosen to do this global history of concentration camps?
Well, unfortunately, right now, I think that we are in a period where sort of intolerance and labeling the other and looking at people as a danger to society, looking at whole groups of people as a danger to society has become acceptable again. And this obviously isn't just in the States. This is something that's happening worldwide. We're seeing it in European elections. We're seeing it here in the U.S. with some of these Nazi demonstrations. We're seeing it in Burma, as you mentioned. And I think there's a little bit of pendulum swings that happen, and certainly, you know, economics can be part of the issue as well. But I think that you do end up in a dangerous loop that we've seen before between sort of a public sentiment rising and then people coming to power that reflect that sentiment and then reflect that idea back to the larger population, where it sometimes gets amplified. So I do think this is a really critical moment for us to be paying attention to some of these issues. And I'd like to say that's why I wrote the book, but of course I started the book years ago before we hit this wave. And at the time, I realized that this was a phenomenon that went further back than the Nazi camps, and it went all the way back to the 1890s. And I don't think people are really aware of this long pre-Nazi death camp history of concentration camps, because looking back from the vantage point of today, the idea of a developed nation bending all its modern might into the annihilation of a people is so huge still in this singular moment in history that it kind of obscures everything that came before and came after. But there's really a very long story that I think needs to be paid attention to, because these things don't rise out of nowhere. And so learning the warning signs, learning to pay attention, seeing how everything did unfold.
Well, so tell us that history. Go back to the turn of the 20th century, right before, to the first concentration camps.
So the first concentration camps were set up by the Spanish Empire in Cuba in the late 1890s. And they were fighting rebellion. So you had these guerrillas, and they weren't able to defeat it, and there were chronic battles over decades. And finally, the governor general there suggested that the only way that they would be able to defeat the rebels who wanted independence would be to sweep all the peasants out of the countryside and put them behind barbed wire. And then you could basically shoot anyone who was left. Anyone who didn't heed the call to report and head into these camps could be identified as an insurgent and shot on sight. And so it was really a frustration with the guerrilla fighters that they couldn't pin down and they couldn't win over, but they couldn't defeat. But the thing is, this man who thought of it did not actually impose those camps, because he wrote to Spain to say that as a representative of a civilization, I can't do this, because this is going to bring misery and hunger, and it's going to be terrible. So Spain recalled him and sent in someone named the Butcher, who was happy to do that. And so that's where the first camps came from. And you actually see that situation with an insurgency or guerrilla war or civil war happening again and again. And once it had been sort of thought of to put these civilians in camp, which was a shocking idea at the time, I mean, worldwide response was that this was going to be tragic and that many people would die. And they were right. More than 100,000 people died in those first camps. And that's a big part of why the U.S. actually went to war with Spain in 1898. Of course, there was the sinking of the Maine that everyone remembers, but the American public had been hearing about these camps and seeing photos of them for a very long time by the time the Maine sunk. And so it really was the huge cause to go to war. And McKinley at the time, the president, McKinley, announced in his call to war to Congress, he said, this is not war by any civilized means. This is extermination, and it leads to nothing but the wilderness and the grave. Unfortunately, after we defeated Spain handily in just a matter of weeks, really, we inherited the Philippines, and just a short number of years later, the U.S. imposed its own concentration camps in the Philippines. So once this idea had taken root in the world, it was really impossible to get rid of. And you saw it used in colonial outposts. And then in World War I, it became this global phenomenon. So it really, in the space of just a few years of World War I, it went from being an institution that had been brought in just a few places to a bureaucracy of civilian detention that sort of went around the world. And from that, once you have that in place, you see all these local versions of camps grow out. So out of the Russian camps from World War I, we see some of the roots of the Gulag. Out of the German camps from World War I, we see some of that institution and the approaches to it borrowed for what become the Nazi camps later. So everyone from there uses their local culture, if you will, some of which had prior forced labor camps in history. They had other things, but they combine it with this idea of mass civilian detention without trial.
Well, one of the places that you mention in the book, and which of course is in the news now, is Burma and the Rohingya camps there. So can you talk about what you found when you were there in 2015?
Yeah, so I went there in June 2015, and it was very interesting because when I went, it was just 2 weeks after Donald Trump had declared his candidacy, and no one was taking him seriously at that point. But the rhetoric he was using already about Muslims, about Latinos, was exactly the rhetoric that I heard when I landed in Sitwe, which is on the western coast of Myanmar and is the capital of Rakhine State, where these Rohingya camps are located. And it was kind of unsettling to me at that time to notice so clearly that this kind of rhetoric is really a universal rhetoric, and the brakes on it seem to be how strong are the institutions in a given place. And of course, in Myanmar, the institutions are not strong. It's a fledgling democracy. It's really made the move only in recent years from a military dictatorship to a democracy, and the military still has a tremendous amount of control. So when I went there, I went to see the camps. I went to Yangon, and then I went to Sitwe. I went into the camps and talked to the Rohingya there. I talked to people in town in Sitwe who were in support of the camps, of their neighbors being held in these camps. And what I found on the side of the detainees was that the rioting that had happened in 2012 that had led to the camps had destabilized the region, and they were unhappy at being put in these camps. But because it was so dangerous for a period of time, there may have been some early protective role for them, as you know, in the camps. So even though they didn't like the camps, they understood that early on it might have been something that saved some of them. But the idea that the camps were temporary, which was said for a long time, 5 years later now is where we are today, is obviously just not true. And they had become very frustrated that there were
We have 5 seconds.
There were no moves being made to try to get them out.
Well, Andrea Pitzer, we want to do part 2, and we'll post online at DemocracyNow.org. Her new book, just out, One Long Night, A Global History of Concentration Camps. And that does it for our show. Juan Gonzalez will be speaking in Newark, New Jersey tonight at the Abyssinian Baptist Church at 7. Then next Friday, not tomorrow, in Kansas City, Missouri. I'll be going all through Canada on the last week of September. Check our website. Our website is DemocracyNow.org. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh. Thanks so much for joining us.